Hello everyone and welcome to Spill Secret. Before we start, we ask you subscribe and leave a comment as to where you are listening from. Let's begin. It began with a clock, an ancient, brass timepiece, set into the wall of the old Wexler estate. The locals called it the midnight clock, though it hadn't struck midnight, or any hour, in decades. Each night, just before dusk, it emitted a strange humming sound that carried through the forest surrounding the crumbling mansion. And though no one dared approach, everyone in town knew the clock's legend. When it struck 12, it was said, time stopped in the house, trapping anyone unlucky enough to be inside. Mara Garrett didn't believe in ghost stories, especially not ones spun by small-town rumor mills. She was a clinical psychologist, rational to the bone, and had recently inherited the old Wexler property from a great-aunt she barely remembered. Mara was in her mid-30s, practical, and, though she wouldn't admit it out loud, achingly lonely. When she decided to pack up and move into the estate, it wasn't out of curiosity but necessity. Her marriage had ended, her job had grown stagnant, and the lure of a fresh start, even in a town as odd as Willowbrook, was too tempting to resist. The first week went by without incident. Mara kept to herself, only venturing into town for groceries. But by the 8th day, she began hearing the stories, the whispers that warned her about the clock. It's just superstition, she told herself, dismissing the warnings as she unpacked dusty boxes of forgotten family heirlooms. Yet, as night fell, she felt a weight in the air, an odd tension she couldn't quite explain. The hum of the clock grew louder, creeping into the silence of her new home, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, Mara found herself alone in the drawing room, her gaze fixed on the massive clock embedded into the wall. It was intricately carved, each brass cog and wheel hidden behind glass, and its face bore no numbers, only a single, frozen hand, pointing permanently at midnight. She ran her fingers along its cool surface, as if by touching it, she could unravel its mystery. Just a broken clock, she murmured, though even to herself, the words felt hollow. She couldn't deny the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. That night, Mara dreamed of the clock. In her dream, it was ticking furiously, its hand spinning faster and faster until it stopped at midnight. The room around her grew hazy, the walls shifting and stretching, and the hum grew into a deafening roar. When she awoke, her hands were trembling, and the silence of the house felt suffocating. She tried to brush it off as the result of too much wine, and an overactive imagination, but the dream lingered, clawing at the edges of her mind. The following day, Mara's resolve began to wane. The townsfolk's stories seeped into her thoughts, and the loneliness of the estate weighed on her. She found herself staring at the clock more often, her curiosity mingling with dread. When she finally met with the town historian, an elderly man named Harold, his face grew dark at the mention of the midnight clock. "The Wexler clock isn't broken," he whispered, voice thick with caution. "It's waiting. When it strikes, it calls to anyone inside." His words left her unsettled, but she laughed it off. That night, Mara stayed up late, sitting across from the clock, her eyes never leaving it. Midnight approached, and a strange energy filled the room. The clock, silent for decades, began to hum softly, as if stirring from a deep slumber. Mara's heart raced, but she couldn't look away, couldn't bring herself to leave. She whispered to herself, "It's only a story." But deep down, a sliver of fear took root, growing with each passing second. The final moment before midnight, the air grew still, thick with anticipation. Mara felt herself drawn to the clock as if by an invisible force, her hand stretching out toward the glass. Then, the hum grew louder, a near-throbbing pulse, and a cold shiver passed through her as she saw the clock's hand twitch ever so slightly toward midnight. As the clock's hand hovered near midnight, Mara felt an inexplicable pull, like an invisible thread tugging her toward it. Her fingers trembled against the glass as she pressed closer, barely breathing. The hum deepened into a vibration that resonated within her chest, as if her heartbeat itself was syncing with the clock. Her pulse raced, each beat in tune with the haunting hum, and when the clock struck midnight, though it hadn't moved in years, she was sure she felt it. The room around her shifted, the air thickening as a strange fog seeped in from nowhere, swirling at her feet. Mara stumbled back, breaking her gaze, blinking to make sense of what she was seeing. Shadows curled in the corners, stretching and twisting like dark fingers clawing their way toward her. The entire atmosphere felt tense and dreamlike, and the walls, once familiar, now seemed foreign, as though she'd crossed into a different place altogether. This isn't real," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the fog. But the chill in her bones said otherwise. A voice echoed softly, calling her name in a breathy, eerie whisper. "Mara, Mara?" She froze, glancing around the room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one, only the relentless fog and the clock, ticking now, despite its motionless hand. She clenched her fists, telling herself she wasn't afraid, that it was just the silence playing tricks on her. Yet, the voice grew louder, each whisper closer than the last, until it was right beside her ear. "Mara, come." The voice urged, gentle yet chilling, filling her with a strange urge to obey. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward, her body moving almost of its own accord, drawn toward the hall that stretched beyond the drawing room. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering like flames, and the hallway appeared longer than she remembered, stretching into what seemed an endless void. She felt like she was descending deeper into some forgotten pocket of the house, a part she hadn't noticed before. Her mind raced as she walked, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, yet her feet refused to listen. She tried to stop, to force herself to turn around, but the pull of the voice, of the clock's hum, was too strong. A door loomed at the end of the hallway, one she was certain hadn't been there before. It was old, crafted from dark wood with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and writhe under her gaze. As she reached for the doorknob, she felt an icy cold shoot through her hand, but the need to open it overpowered her fear. Inside, she found a dimly lit room lined with mirrors, each one cracked and worn. Her reflection stared back at her, dozens of identical, frightened versions of herself trapped within the glass. But something was off. In each mirror, her reflection moved just a beat too slow, a disturbing lag that sent a chill down her spine. She took a shaky breath, her eyes scanning each fractured version of herself, when one reflection, the one nearest to her, smiled. "You don't belong here, Mara," it said, its voice a chilling imitation of her own. She stumbled backward, the oppressive air pressing against her chest, stealing her breath. Her mind screamed for escape, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. She felt her strength waning, as if the room was drawing something out of her, draining her. Shadows flickered in the mirrors, and her other reflections started to laugh softly, a symphony of hollow voices echoing in the room. "Come back, Mara," they chanted, their hands pressed against the glass, fingers splayed as if desperate to break through. Her hands shaking, she forced herself to turn and run, tearing herself from the mirrors and racing down the hallway, back toward the drawing room. The shadows followed, growing darker, faster, twisting into monstrous shapes that lunged at her, reaching for her as she ran. The clock's hum grew louder, almost a scream now, filling her head until she thought it would split. As she stumbled into the drawing room, the fog dissipated, and everything returned to normal. The clock was silent once more, its hand still frozen at midnight, yet Mara knew she'd felt it move, just for a moment. Mara sat on the floor of the drawing room, her back pressed against the cold wall, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she stared at the clock, which now seemed like an ordinary, silent object. She wanted to convince herself that it was all a hallucination, that her mind was playing tricks on her, but the echoes of the voices, the chill in her bones, they felt too real. She couldn't deny the dread lingering in the air, like something just waiting to resurface. The next morning, Mara visited Harold, the town historian, once more. This time, there was no trace of her skepticism. She demanded answers, clutching her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice barely a whisper but filled with urgency. "No more folklore or hints, tell me what happened in that house. What's with the clock?" Harold eyed her with a grim look, as if he'd been expecting her return. With a heavy sigh, he gestured for her to sit. "The Wexler estate has a dark history," he began slowly, glancing around as though fearing someone might overhear. "The clock was crafted by Thomas Wexler himself, an eccentric man with a deep fascination for the occult. Rumor has it he intended to trap time, to create a place where he could live forever. But something went wrong." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "People say he managed to stop time in that house, but not in the way he wanted. Instead of preserving life, he trapped spirits, his own included." Mara listened, a chill crawling up her spine. The stories she'd dismissed so easily before now seemed disturbingly plausible. "What happens when the clock strikes midnight?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. Harold looked at her, his eyes clouded with something between pity and fear. "If it strikes midnight," he said quietly, "it calls to the living, pulls them in, and holds them until... well, until they're no longer living." Back at the estate, Mara paced, her mind racing. She considered leaving, abandoning the house and returning to the city, but she knew that something inside her had changed. Curiosity, or perhaps obsession, had taken hold. She couldn't leave, not until she understood what was happening. That night, she prepared herself. She set up candles around the drawing room, hoping their warm light would ward off whatever darkness lurked within the clock. She stayed up, watching it with wary eyes, as if it might spring to life at any moment. As the clock neared midnight, the hum began again, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the room with that familiar, eerie vibration. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay seated, clutching the edge of her chair. She told herself she wouldn't fall into the same trap, wouldn't let herself be pulled into whatever strange dimension she'd seen the night before. But as the clock's hum grew louder, she felt her resolve waver, her body drawn toward it as though her very will was being stripped away. "Mara!" A voice called, low and insistent, echoing through the walls. This time, it wasn't coming from the clock, but from somewhere deeper within the house. She forced herself to stand, fighting the fear that gripped her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. The voice didn't answer, but instead repeated, "Come." It was a command, and against every instinct, she found herself moving toward the sound, down the hall and through a doorway she had never noticed before. She found herself in a room that seemed untouched by time, covered in dust and dimly lit by an old, swinging bulb. In the center of the room was a chair, and on it sat a figure, an old man with a gaunt, ghostly face, his eyes hollow and fixed on the clock he clutched in his hands. He looked up at her, his expression devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice as brittle as dead leaves. Mara's heart froze, and she knew, without needing him to explain, that she was staring into the face of Thomas Wexler. Mara's mind reeled as she faced the apparition of Thomas Wexler. His hollow, sunken eyes bore into her with an intensity that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body felt frozen, rooted to the spot by an unnatural force. Wexler lifted the clock in his hands, cradling it like a fragile child, his bony fingers brushing over the brass with reverence. "Time," he whispered, almost to himself. So fleeting, so precious. Yet here, I can hold it. Mara found her voice, though it wavered with terror. What? What have you done to this place? She asked, forcing each word out as if through a fog. Wexler's gaze shifted to her, his eyes filled with something beyond the mortal realm, a darkness, deep and endless. I wanted to live beyond time, he murmured, his voice thin as paper. To escape death's grasp. But I didn't account for the cost. He leaned forward, the faint shadow of a smile tugging at his cracked lips. Now, I am here. Forever. The room seemed to pulse with his words, and Mara felt her heart beat in time with the clock's hum, which had resumed its haunting rhythm. She took a step back, panic rising. I don't want any part of this, she whispered, but even as she spoke, she felt the clock's pull stronger than ever, as if it was latching onto her very soul. Wexler's gaze hardened. You're already part of it, he said, his tone chillingly final. Anyone who steps into this house, who hears the midnight hum, becomes one with it. The clock's curse knows no mercy. Desperation clawed at her. She had to escape, had to find a way out before midnight struck again. But as she turned to leave, the walls shifted, the doorway that had led her in now gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken walls. She was trapped. She whirled back to face Wexler, her voice trembling. Please, there must be a way to stop this, she pleaded, her words laced with fear. Wexler's expression softened, a hint of regret flickering in his eyes. There is one way, he said slowly, his gaze dropping to the clock in his hands. If you take my place, he continued, lifting the clock toward her. You become its keeper. The clock demands a soul to keep it alive, someone to tend to it, someone to suffer. Mara felt the weight of his words sink in heavy and cold. She knew the choice he was offering, and the horror of it struck her to her core. No, she whispered, shaking her head, but even as she denied it, she felt a strange resignation settle over her, a feeling that perhaps this had always been her fate. Wexler held the clock out to her, his skeletal fingers trembling. I've waited too long, he said, his voice barely audible. Take it, Mara, and let me rest. She backed away, her heart pounding, but the pull of the clock was relentless. It seemed to draw the breath from her, leeching her will, until her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and grasped the cold, ancient metal. The moment her fingers touched it, the world around her shattered, spiraling into darkness as the room faded, and Wexler's figure dissolved like smoke, leaving her alone with the clock. As the last chime of midnight faded, Mara stood in the silent, empty house, the clock in her hands. She felt its hum settle into her chest, like a second heartbeat, and a cold realization washed over her. The estate, the clock, its curse, they were now bound to her. She was its keeper, its prisoner, locked in a timeless loop as the shadows gathered around her, whispering her name. The hands of the clock crept forward, the minutes slipping away, counting down to another midnight, another soul drawn in, just as she had been. And so, Mara waited, her gaze fixed on the clock's face, knowing that eventually, someone else would come to inherit the Wexler estate. Someone who, like her, would dismiss the legends and ignore the warnings. She would be here, waiting, bound to the curse, listening to the hum of the midnight clock. And when they came, she would welcome them, as the new keeper, offering them the same terrible choice. The clock struck 12, and Mara's hollow eyes closed, settling into her endless vigil as time in the Wexler estate began again, but only within its cursed walls. The silence of the house was filled with a chilling certainty, no one ever truly left the midnight clock. When Cassie signed the lease for her new apartment on the 15th floor of the Gold Crest Tower, she felt a strange shiver run down her spine. The building was an imposing structure, 40 floors of concrete and glass, nestled in the heart of the city, yet it had a brooding stillness to it. Quiet neighbors, lots of privacy, the property manager had assured her. And as Cassie took her first steps into her new home, she thought maybe she'd found just the sanctuary she needed. She'd come here to escape, to start fresh after a year of emotional chaos. But the strange emptiness that filled the hallways, even in the daylight, made her wonder if she'd chosen the wrong place. The apartment itself was spacious and clean, with large windows overlooking the city. Cassie loved the view. At night, she could see the twinkling lights stretching far into the distance, an ocean of stars in a concrete sky. Still, there was something else about the place she couldn't quite shake. A persistent sensation, like an uninvited whisper lingering in the corners of her mind, urging her to stay alert. She shrugged it off, hoping it was just nerves or the exhaustion of moving. After all, she reasoned, any change could stir up lingering anxieties. A week passed before Cassie noticed the faint sounds. At first, she thought it was the building settling or the air ducts shifting with the change in temperature. But the sounds were irregular, barely discernible above the usual hum of the apartment. They came at odd hours, mostly around midnight, like soft, muffled voices slipping through the walls. Cassie lay awake, listening, telling herself it was probably just the neighbors, someone's late-night TV or a phone call. Yet the voices had an eerie quality to them, a sense of urgency that seeped through, making her heart pound. She never could catch a clear word, just a low murmur that made her feel watched. One night, as she sat by her window trying to focus on a book, she heard it again, a faint, persistent whisper, just at the edge of her hearing. It seemed to come from the ceiling, like someone pacing in the apartment above. Frustrated, she pressed her ear against the wall, hoping to decipher it. Nothing. Just a low, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat, or maybe even breathing. She shook her head and laughed it off. "I'm letting this place get to me," she muttered. But as she turned to walk away, she swore she heard her name, softly, but unmistakably, Cassie. Her blood went cold. Cassie jerked her head back to the wall, eyes wide, heart hammering. But there was nothing. Silence. She couldn't bring herself to laugh this off, there was no mistaking that sound. Someone had whispered her name. The apartment above hers was vacant, she remembered. The property manager had mentioned it when she'd moved in. So, who? The next day, she went down to the lobby to speak with Mr. Whittaker, the building's maintenance man. He was an older man, wiry and quiet, with deep-set eyes that looked as though they'd seen too much. "Everything all right, Miss Rhodes?" he asked, his gaze lingering on her, as if he already knew the answer. "Have there been issues with the soundproofing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I keep hearing things at night. Voices, almost." Whittaker's expression didn't change, but she noticed a flicker in his eyes. "These old buildings, they have a way of keeping secrets," he said slowly. "Sometimes, the walls remember things. I'd say it's best not to go looking too close. Just focus on the living, Ms. Rhodes. Only the living." He gave her a small, tight smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and turned away, leaving her with a sick feeling in her gut. That night, as Cassie lay in bed, staring at the shadows cast by the city lights creeping through her blinds, the voices returned. Louder this time, more distinct, rising and falling in a frantic rhythm. Her skin prickled as the whispers seemed to swirl around her, filling her ears with half-formed words and fractured sentences, like a broken radio picking up signals from another world. Cassie clutched her pillow, heart racing, her mind filled with images of faces she didn't recognize, of pleading eyes and twisted mouths. She could feel them, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, all vying for her attention. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the whispers stopped. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating, and then a single voice broke through, clear and calm. "Help us, Cassie." It was close, so close it felt like the person was right beside her. Cassie's breath hitched. She whipped her head around, but the room was empty. Only her own wide-eyed reflection stared back at her from the window, pale and frightened. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions and half-formed fears. Who was whispering to her? And why? In the stillness of her apartment, she felt an unsettling certainty gnawing at her. Whatever was haunting the walls of the Goldcrest Tower wasn't done with her yet. Cassie awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, the echoes of last night's whispers still clinging to her like a second skin. She looked around, her heart racing, but the apartment was silent. The city skyline was cloaked in early morning haze, the buildings casting long shadows across her room. She hadn't dreamed it, the voice had been real. She could still hear it in her mind, "Help us, Cassie." Her mind turned over the words, trying to find some rational explanation. But no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it, the plea lingered, scratching at her nerves like a wound that wouldn't heal. Determined not to let the whispers ruin her sense of peace, Cassie spent the day out, exploring the city. She wandered through bustling streets, visited a small cafe, and even stopped by a bookstore. Yet, no matter how far she walked or how many people surrounded her, the unease clung to her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking just out of sight. She knew she was being paranoid, but every time she tried to brush it off, a voice in her head whispered, "Don't go back." As the day wore on, she felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to return to the Goldcrest Tower. It was as if the building itself had woven a thread around her, tugging her back. When she finally arrived at her apartment, the air felt different, thicker, colder. She hesitated before unlocking her door, heart pounding. But when she entered, nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was as she'd left it, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Yet, beneath that familiar silence, she sensed something. Watching. That night, Cassie lay in bed, eyes open, listening. She tried to convince herself it was all in her head, that the voices were just echoes of her imagination. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became unbearable, pressing down on her like a weight. Just when she thought she could finally drift off, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Her breath caught. The sound was coming from inside her closet, slow and deliberate, like fingers drumming on wood. Swallowing her fear, Cassie swung her legs out of bed and walked toward the closet, her heart pounding so loudly she could feel it in her throat. She reached out, hand trembling, and opened the door. The tapping stopped, and all she found was a row of neatly hung clothes and her spare shoes. But just as she was about to close the door, she noticed something unusual, a piece of folded paper lying on the closet floor, right beneath a coat she hadn't worn in weeks. Frowning, she picked it up and unfolded it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words, "They are here." Cassie's stomach churned as she reread the words, her mind racing with questions. Who could have left this note? She hadn't had any visitors since she moved in, and she was certain no one else had a key to her apartment. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the note wasn't just a warning, it felt like a message meant specifically for her. But who were they? Sleep was out of the question. Cassie spent the rest of the night pacing her apartment, every creak and shadow fueling her unease. Just as dawn broke, she made a decision, she needed answers. She remembered Mr. Whittaker's odd warning about the walls keeping secrets. Maybe he knew something about the building's history, something that could explain the strange occurrences. She hurried downstairs, hoping he would be in his office. She found him in the basement, hunched over a table cluttered with tools. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded. "Miss Rhodes," he greeted her, his voice wary. Cassie held out the note. "Do you know anything about this?" Mr. Whittaker's face went pale as he glanced at the paper, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I hoped it wouldn't come to this," he muttered. "But I guess you deserve to know. This building. It's old, older than most people realize. And over the years, there've been incidents. People who lived here and didn't leave." Cassie's pulse quickened. "What do you mean, didn't leave?" "Missing," he replied, voice barely above a whisper. "Some say they vanished without a trace. Others think they linger. I don't know what's real and what isn't. But whatever's here, it doesn't like to be ignored. And it has a way of making itself known to certain people." "Certain people?" Cassie repeated, her voice shaking. "People like you, who see things others don't," he said, his gaze hardening. "Once they notice you, there's no turning back." Cassie felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. She wanted to protest, to tell him she didn't see things. But deep down, she knew he was right. Whatever haunted the walls of the Goldcrest Tower had chosen her, and now, there was no escaping it. Cassie returned to her apartment feeling hollow, her thoughts a jumble of fear and disbelief. Mr. Whittaker's words echoed in her mind, people who lived here and didn't leave. She couldn't shake the image of the missing residents, their lives erased, replaced by whispers that filled the building like ghosts haunting the walls. She sat by the window, staring out at the city below, and wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. For the first time, she felt truly trapped. That night, Cassie's sleep was fractured and uneasy. Shadows crept through her dreams, faceless figures standing in the corners of her room, watching her with hollow eyes. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, only to find the whispers waiting for her, murmuring from the walls with an intensity she hadn't heard before. The voices were no longer just noise, they were urgent, pleading, almost desperate. She could make out fragments, disjointed words that chilled her to the bone. Help. Lost. Here. Desperate for relief, Cassie pulled her pillow over her head, trying to drown them out. But it was no use. The whispers grew louder, merging into one tortured voice that filled her mind until she couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the voices fell silent. Cassie lay there, heart pounding, the silence ringing in her ears. She'd almost convinced herself it was over when a new sound emerged, a soft, slow creaking, like footsteps moving across the floor. Cassie's skin prickled as the footsteps came closer, stopping just outside her bedroom door. She held her breath, straining to listen, every nerve in her body on edge. The door didn't open, but she could feel a presence standing there, waiting. A low, guttural whisper slipped through the cracks. "Let us in, Cassie." A shiver ran through her, and she clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. She wanted to run, to get out of this apartment and never look back. But something held her in place, a twisted sense of obligation that made her feel like she was bound to this place, like it had somehow claimed her. "You have to know," a voice in her head insisted, "you have to understand." The next morning, exhausted and shaken, Cassie decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She needed to find out who these voices belonged to, why they were reaching out to her. Armed with only her phone and a pen, she began knocking on doors throughout the building, hoping someone might share her experiences or, at the very least, give her a clue about the building's strange history. Most of the residents brushed her off, dismissing her with polite smiles or confused glances. But on the 20th floor, she met Mrs. Calder, an elderly woman with thinning white hair and trembling hands. "Ah, you've heard them too," Mrs. Calder said, her voice barely a whisper. "The voices? They come at night, don't they?" Cassie nodded, feeling a surge of relief. "Yes. I thought I was going crazy." Mrs. Calder's expression darkened. "You're not crazy, dear. They're real. I've lived here long enough to know. They say it's the ones who never left, those poor souls. Trapped. Sometimes, if you listen close, you can even hear their names." "Names?" Cassie asked, heart pounding. "Have you ever tried to talk to them?" Mrs. Calder shook her head slowly, her eyes glassy. "No. I pretend not to hear. I don't want them to know I'm listening. Once they know you're listening, they won't stop until you're one of them." Cassie's blood ran cold. She thanked Mrs. Calder and hurried back to her apartment, her mind racing. If the whispers belonged to the spirits of the missing residents, then maybe, just maybe, they were reaching out to her for a reason. She spent the rest of the day researching the Goldcrest Tower, combing through newspaper archives and obscure online forums, hoping to find any mention of disappearances or strange incidents. After hours of searching, she found a single article buried in an old news database. "Local high-rise mourns loss of tenant after mysterious death," the headline read. The article was brief, detailing the death of a young woman who had fallen, or perhaps been pushed, from her apartment window nearly 20 years ago. Her name was Lillian Gray, and according to the article, her death had been ruled a suicide, though friends claimed she'd shown no signs of distress. There was one chilling detail that stood out. In the weeks before her death, Lillian had told friends about hearing voices in her apartment, voices that wouldn't let her sleep. Cassie sat back, her hands trembling as she reread the article. She felt a strange kinship with Lillian, a bond that made her skin crawl. Was Lillian one of the voices she'd been hearing? And if so, what had driven her to such a tragic end? As night fell, Cassie braced herself for the inevitable return of the whispers. But this time, she was determined to listen, to try and make sense of their pleas. She sat by her bedroom door, her heart pounding as the voices began to rise around her, a chorus of sorrow and desperation. This time, she could make out faint, fractured phrases. "They took us. We're still here. Trapped. Cassie. Help. Us?" Her mind swirled with fear and confusion, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want from me?" she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "How can I help you?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single, clear voice broke through, a voice she instinctively knew belonged to Lillian. "Find the truth, Cassie. Don't let them hide us anymore." A chill ran through her as the voices faded, leaving her alone in the oppressive quiet. She knew then that she couldn't leave, not until she'd uncovered whatever dark secrets lay buried within the walls of the Goldcrest Tower. Cassie didn't waste any time the next day. She was consumed with the need to uncover whatever secrets were hidden in the Goldcrest Tower, knowing that the lives, or at least the memories, of those trapped souls depended on her. She spent hours searching through public records, scouring the archives for anything connected to the building. It was exhausting work, but finally, she stumbled upon a series of disturbing reports, a string of mysterious disappearances, all residents of the tower, spanning back decades. Each case had been filed quietly, with little media coverage and even fewer answers. A chilling realization dawned on her. They were erased, she thought, their stories silenced. It was as if someone wanted to cover up the tragedies within the building, leaving only the whispers as a testament to their existence. And if she was right, it meant someone, or something, within the Goldcrest Tower wanted those souls forgotten. Cassie returned to her apartment with a newfound resolve. The building's darkness felt different now, as if the walls were alive, pulsing with the trapped energy of the forgotten. She turned on every light, hoping to chase away the shadows, and braced herself for what she needed to do. Taking a deep breath, she spoke aloud, her voice steady. "Lillian, I'm here. I'll help you find peace." The response was immediate. A cold gust blew through her apartment, rattling the windows and flickering the lights. The whispers began again, more distinct, and she felt their presence pressing closer. She closed her eyes, allowing the voices to wash over her, and soon, she began to make sense of them. Names and faces flashed in her mind, dozens of them, people who had once lived vibrant lives but had vanished without a trace. Suddenly, she felt a pull toward the closet, where she'd first found the eerie note. She hesitated, but something urged her forward. She opened the closet door and, with trembling hands, began to inspect the walls. Her fingers traced the edges of the plaster until she felt a slight indentation, almost like a seam. Driven by a sudden urgency, she pried at the plaster, tearing away chunks until her hands found something solid, a hidden compartment. Inside, she found an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, and as she flipped through the pages, her heart pounded. The journal belonged to Lillian Gray, and within its pages, she detailed her experiences in the tower, the voices, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched. But the last few pages held something far more chilling. She discovered a hidden room in the basement, a room that, according to her notes, reeks of death and despair. Cassie's stomach twisted, but she knew she had to see it for herself. She made her way down to the basement, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. The basement was dimly lit and filled with a thick, musty odor. As she ventured deeper, she noticed a small door tucked behind an old, forgotten storage shelf. The handle was rusted, and the wood creaked as she pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Her flashlight beam cut through the thick gloom as she made her way down. The air grew colder, and a suffocating sense of dread filled the space. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, windowless room, the walls lined with strange symbols, scrawled in what looked like charcoal. The symbols seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, and Cassie had to steady herself to keep from running back up the stairs. In the center of the room lay a pile of old, tattered belongings, photographs, clothes, trinkets. Cassie's heart ached as she realized they were the personal effects of the missing residents. Lillian's last journal entry came back to her, "They took us down here. This is where we end." Cassie reached down and picked up a photograph, her hands trembling. The faces staring back at her were haunted, their eyes empty, pleading. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" she whispered, her voice breaking. As if in response, the whispers returned, swirling around her, filling the air with sorrow and relief. But beneath the relief was something darker, an undercurrent of anger directed at those who'd silenced them. She could feel their pain, their rage, and she knew what she had to do. These people had been robbed of their voices, their stories wiped away, and it was time for the world to know. Cassie left the basement with Lillian's journal and the photograph, determined to expose the truth. She didn't care about the consequences. She spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence, connecting the disappearances to the building, and documenting Lillian's account. She even reached out to a local reporter, sharing her findings. The story of the Goldcrest Tower's haunted past was too powerful to stay buried, and soon, the story spread. In the days that followed, Cassie noticed a change in the building. The voices grew quieter, less frantic, as if they'd found some measure of peace. And one night, as she lay in bed, she felt a familiar presence, a soft whisper in her ear. "Thank you, Cassie." She smiled, feeling a warmth that hadn't been there before, a sense of closure that filled the empty spaces in her heart. But just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard it, a single, quiet whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Help us, Cassie." Her eyes snapped open, her heart sinking as she realized the truth. The Goldcrest Tower was far from finished. For every soul she had freed, there were countless others still waiting, trapped within the walls, each one a voice waiting to be heard. The small town of Brindlewood had always been draped in a veil of quietude. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to escape the noise of the world, nestled away from prying eyes, hidden among miles of dark forest. On the outskirts of town, where no one dared go anymore, sat an old playground, half buried in moss and rust. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, a relic of laughter now swallowed by time and silence. But for 12-year-old Benny Langston, it was a place of magnetic fascination. Benny was a scrappy, imaginative kid with a stubborn streak, always trying to convince his friends to explore the abandoned places around town. "There's gotta be something cool there," he'd say, his brown eyes bright with curiosity. But no one dared join him, not since the rumors began to spread. Tales of strange shadows, whispers in the wind, and the faint, unsettling laughter of children long gone kept the kids at bay. One rainy afternoon, Benny's mother noticed he was missing. She felt a pit open in her stomach, and her thoughts drifted toward that playground. Her husband, Frank, had always warned her never to talk about it, to let it fade from their memories like an old nightmare. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had drawn her son to that cursed place. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof as if to remind her of time slipping away. Grabbing her coat, she called up Benny's friends, one by one. Each one said they hadn't seen him since lunchtime, but one of them, a timid girl named Sarah, whispered something that froze her blood. "He said he was going to find the swings," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. Benny's mother could barely breathe as she stepped out into the storm. Memories of the playground haunted her as she made her way through the mud-slicked forest path. She hadn't thought about that place in years, not since she'd heard the stories of children going missing, of how the playground seemed to whisper their names, beckoning them in a voice only they could hear. Frank had told her they were just tales meant to scare children, but now, with her son missing, those tales took on a terrifying new meaning. As she neared the playground, her flashlight cutting through the mist, she saw the twisted shapes of rusted swings and broken slides rising out of the fog like ghostly sentinels. The air was thick and stagnant, smelling of damp earth and rotting wood. She shivered, feeling as if she were being watched, as though the playground itself was alive, breathing in sync with her quickening heart. Then she heard it, a faint, distant laughter echoing through the trees. She froze, her breath hitching as she scanned the empty playground, desperately searching for any sign of Benny. But all she could see were shadows stretching like clawed hands across the wet ground. And in that moment, she knew, something was waiting for her. Something that had been waiting for years. Benny's mother, Marla, took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding louder than the storm around her. The shadows of the twisted playground equipment seemed to stretch and reach for her, as if alive, wanting to pull her into their depths. Her eyes darted to the swings, then to the slide, each piece of equipment looking strangely malevolent in the dim light of her flashlight. She could almost hear a faint squeak, like the groaning of rusty chains, though she saw nothing moving. But as she peered closer, a small figure appeared near the old carousel, shrouded in mist. "Benny?" she called, her voice shaky and thin. The figure remained still for a moment, then took a small step toward her. She felt a wave of relief and dread wash over her all at once. But as she edged closer, the figure became clearer, and it wasn't Benny. It was another child, a little girl, her pale face streaked with dirt and tears, her dark hair matted and tangled. Marla gasped, stumbling back. Who are you?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. The girl just looked at her with hollow eyes, empty and lifeless. Then, almost mechanically, she raised a hand and pointed toward the swings, her finger trembling. Marla followed the girl's gesture, and there, silhouetted against the grey sky, was Benny. He sat on one of the rusty swings, swaying ever so slightly, his head bowed, shoulders hunched. Relief flooded her, and she ran to him, reaching out to pull him into her arms. "Benny, oh my God, I've been looking everywhere," but as her hands touched his shoulders, he remained limp, as though unaware of her presence. "Benny, honey, talk to me," she said, gently lifting his face. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking and glassy, like he was in a trance. She shook him slightly, hoping to jolt him back to awareness, but he remained eerily silent. Panic welled in her throat. This was her son, yet something felt terribly wrong, as if he were merely a shell of himself. Then, a voice that seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet, whispered, "They belong to us now." Marla's heart dropped. She whipped her head around, searching for the source, but the only other presence was the little girl, standing motionless, her finger still pointing. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as she realized the girl wasn't pointing at the swings anymore, she was pointing at Marla. No, this isn't real," Marla stammered, backing away, pulling Benny along with her. But her son's feet dragged against the ground, his body heavy and unyielding, as if some unseen force was holding him back. "You have to wake up, Benny? Please, baby, wake up," she pleaded, her voice breaking. In response, Benny's lips parted, and he spoke in a hollow, distant voice that sent a shiver through her bones. They said we could play forever, Mom. Just like they did." And as he spoke, Marla's mind was flooded with images, faint but vivid, like memories. Children playing, laughing, then fading into silence, their faces growing pale and distant, one by one, like ghosts slipping into the fog. Marla felt a cold dread wrap around her, rooting her to the ground as her son's lifeless words hung in the damp, chilling air. "They said we could play forever," he had whispered, his voice hollow and detached, as though he were speaking from somewhere far beyond. She clutched his small hand, her knuckles turning white, refusing to let go even as every instinct screamed at her to run. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural silence that swallowed every sound of the storm around them. Only the faint creak of the rusty swing chains echoed in the distance. The little girl was gone, vanished into the fog as silently as she had appeared. Marla's eyes darted around, seeking any sign of movement, any hint of life, but all she saw were the ghostly outlines of the playground structures, frozen in eerie stillness. Then she heard it. Faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, a soft, childish giggle floated toward her. She spun around, and for the briefest of moments, she saw them, children, barely more than shadows, flitting between the swings and slides, their laughter rising and falling in eerie harmony. Their faces were pale and indistinct, like fading photographs, and their eyes held a sadness that chilled her to her core. "Benny, we need to leave," Marla said, her voice trembling as she tried to pull him along, but he stood firm, his gaze locked on something beyond her, something she couldn't see. "Benny, please," she pleaded, desperation seeping into her tone. But he shook his head, his expression vacant, lost in a world she couldn't reach. "They're my friends now, Mom," he whispered, and his voice sounded so distant, so unlike him, that it broke her heart. "They showed me things. Things that happened here. Secrets buried in the dirt." His small hand slipped from hers as he turned to the carousel, where the shadows of children seemed to beckon him forward, their faint, ghostly hands reaching out in invitation. Marla felt panic twist inside her, clawing at her throat. She lunged forward, grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him. "No. Benny, you don't understand. They're not your friends. This place. It's wrong. You have to come back with me. You have to come home." She could feel tears slipping down her cheeks, mixing with the rain as she fought to hold on to him. But Benny looked at her, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened, the boy she knew flickering back into view. "They said I can stay with them, Mom. Forever. They're so lonely?" His gaze shifted, drifting back to the shadows that surrounded them, his voice filled with a strange, sad longing. "Please, don't listen to them, Benny," she choked out, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're lying to you. They want to keep you here. This place is cursed, can't you feel it? It's not safe." She reached for his hand again, her fingers tightening around his as though her grip alone could keep him anchored to the real world. But the shadows were closing in, their voices growing louder, more insistent. She could hear them now, murmuring her son's name, each whisper filling her with a sickening dread. And as she looked around, she realized that they weren't just children, among them were figures of adults, their faces twisted in sorrow and fear, their eyes hollow and accusing. "You took them from us," one of the shadows murmured, and Marla's heart lurched as a figure, barely visible in the fog, moved closer, its eyes fixed on her with a burning intensity. "You left them to play. Forgotten?" The voice was filled with resentment, laced with an anger that felt centuries old. Marla's grip on Benny tightened as the realization dawned on her. This wasn't just a playground, it was a place of loss, of memories buried and abandoned, a graveyard of innocence. And somehow, it had been waiting, feeding on the forgotten, calling to those who could still hear its whispers. "Benny, we have to go. Now," she cried, panic clawing at her voice as the shadows pressed closer, their voices rising in a haunting chorus. But Benny hesitated, his gaze lingering on the playground, as if torn between two worlds. And in that moment, Marla knew, if she didn't pull him away, she would lose him forever. Marla gathered every ounce of strength she had left and pulled Benny hard, wrenching him out of the trance that seemed to grip him. He stumbled but finally looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "Mom?" he asked, his voice small and frightened, like he was waking from a terrible dream. Relief flooded Marla, but she knew they weren't safe yet. The shadows continued to press closer, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. "Run, Benny. Don't look back," she shouted, her voice raw with fear. Together, they sprinted across the muddy, overgrown playground, her hand tightly gripping his, guiding him toward the path that led back to town. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the ground itself were trying to hold them back, pulling at their feet with invisible hands. She could feel the shadows watching them, their whispers growing louder, filled with anger and sorrow. As they neared the edge of the playground, a figure blocked their path, a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a face contorted in anguish. He reached out, his voice trembling. "You left us here. You all left us here to rot, to be forgotten," he whispered, his words a mournful accusation. Marla felt a pang of guilt, realizing that this place had been abandoned, its memories erased, the souls left behind with no one to remember them. "We didn't know," she said, her voice breaking as she clutched Benny protectively. "We didn't know this would happen. Please, let us go." The man's gaze softened, and he looked down at Benny, his expression filled with sadness. The shadows behind him murmured, their voices blending into a sorrowful harmony that echoed through the fog. Go? But remember us. Remember the children who once played here. Don't let them be forgotten, he said, his form fading into the mist. Marla nodded, her heart heavy with the promise she made to herself, to remember, to tell the story of this place, so that its memory would live on. She pulled Benny closer and took a shaky step forward, feeling the shadows recede, granting them passage. As they reached the path leading out of the forest, Marla risked a glance back. The playground was shrouded in mist once more, the shapes of swings and slides barely visible in the haze. But she could see the faint outlines of figures watching her, silent and still, their expressions a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She turned away, tightening her grip on Benny's hand as they made their way back to town, leaving the haunted playground behind. Back in Brindlewood, the townsfolk gathered around Marla and Benny, their faces pale as they listened to her story. Some shook their heads, dismissing it as the ramblings of a frightened mother, while others listened with quiet, fearful understanding. The older residents exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. Marla knew she couldn't convince everyone, but she also knew she had to keep her promise. The playground's memory would live on, even if only in whispers and tales passed down from generation to generation. As the days went by, Marla and Benny settled back into their lives, though a lingering shadow hung over them. Benny rarely spoke of what happened, but sometimes, late at night, Marla would hear him whisper in his sleep, his voice filled with sadness. They just wanted someone to remember them, he would say, his words echoing in the stillness of their home. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Marla returned to the edge of the forest, alone. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, placing them at the entrance of the path leading to the forgotten playground. Standing there, she closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer for the souls left behind, a promise to keep their memories alive. And as she turned to leave, she felt a faint, cool breeze brush against her cheek, like a soft, grateful whisper. She knew then that they were at peace, their story finally heard. Brindlewood would move on, and the playground would fade into myth, but the memory of those lost children would linger, a quiet, ghostly presence, waiting only to be remembered. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out our channel for more stories.